Hello, welcome back to our bookshop in Tring. I'm Ben Morehouse. So we've got another author interview today, and we're lucky enough to be talking to historian Tracy Borman. She wrote this beautiful piece, Henry VIII and the Men Who Made Him, as well as a number of other books. But we're going to be talking to her about The King's Witch. This is the first in a trilogy. The second, Devil's Slave, was out in hardback last year. It's out in paperback in September. And her third one, Fallen Angel, is out in November in hardback. So she's in conversation with a good friend of ours and colleague of hers, Alice Adams.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you, Tracy. And hello, thanks for being able to join us and give a bit of your spare time this afternoon.
It's a great pleasure, and it's my first online literary festival / event, so I'm very excited.
Oh, brilliant. Now, usually you and I are talking about work. I'm normally picking your brain with your Historic Royal Palace's curatorial hat on about exhibitions and things like that. But looking forward today to finding out, well, getting a bit of a lowdown about the brilliant King's Witch trilogy that you've written, and also a little bit about your most recent historical book about Henry VIII. So it's really nice to not talk about work, although it kind of is work related. So I guess most people will know you as a Tudor historian. They'll know you from television and your non-fiction books, and obviously your role at Historic Royal Palace. But I guess they might not have discovered the King's Witch trilogy yet. So I guess the first book kind of dives into the decadent, dangerous court of James I and VI. Could you give us a little bit about the story?
Absolutely. And I have to say it was a dream come true for me to write fiction, because I read it all the time. Historical fiction is sort of my guilty pleasure, really, when I'm not at work, when I'm not researching non-fiction. I absolutely love historical fiction. So I've always wanted to write a novel. And yeah, I chose a really intriguing period in our history, quite a dark period. As you mentioned, I mean, James VI, sorry Alice, fellow Scot, obviously, but he's not all good, I think we can say.
I feel a bit ashamed of him.
Well, he was a great intellect. He had many gifts, but he was also a man of great obsessions, and his overriding obsession was with witchcraft. He absolutely believed in the existence of witches. He thought they were the number one evil in society, and he saw himself as appointed by God to wipe them off the face of the earth. So this really launched a kind of reign of terror, both in Scotland and then also in England when he became king there in 1603. And that really was the inspiration for my trilogy. Now, there's a reason for this, because I wrote a non-fiction book about James and the witch hunts, and it was so dramatic and so terrifying. It made me want to dramatize it, not just tell the kind of straight history. Now, my cat has just appeared on my desk next to me, so you can probably just see the outline of a town. I knew one of my pets was going to make an appearance at some stage, so apologies for that.
It's all part of the fun. I love it.
Great.
Well, so yeah, I guess it is a really interesting period of history, and yeah, it must have been a nice challenge. And is that the reason, because you wanted to dramatize it, is that why you decided to move into doing something fictional?
Yes, it was really, as I said, it's a long-held dream of mine to do it, and it was this particular subject. It really moved me when I was researching a real witchcraft case for my non-fiction book, Witches. And I just felt it almost wasn't enough just to tell the real history. I wanted to kind of really convey that terror, that horror. And really it just started out as a bit of a pipe dream. I started drafting some stuff, didn't show it to anybody. It was more for my own personal amusement. And then as ever, it's down to a twist of fate or fortune. And I got chatting to an editor, a fiction editor at a literary festival up in Harrogate. And he is now my editor for my novels, and he just encouraged me, really. He said, well, just develop your ideas, maybe send me something, and it went from there. And so it really is such a thrill, but a really different skill, I have to say, writing fiction to non-fiction, and I had to learn that pretty quickly.
Yeah, it must be quite a contrast. And
It is making stuff up. We're not encouraged to make stuff up at HRP, or indeed in the world of non-fiction. You know, you tell it how it was. And but I think what I found was the wonderful freedom of fiction, because we always have those moments, whether working at the palaces or when I'm writing non-fiction, of there being gaps in the sources where we really want to know something, but the information just isn't there. And with fiction, you can use your imagination to fill those gaps. So it is very nice and liberating sometimes.
yeah, I guess that must have been one of the kind of the interesting but the challenging things about your main character, because she's not purely fictional, is she?
She's not. And any would-be novelist out there, or historical novelist, I would urge you to follow my example. I can't say that it was intentional, but that if you choose a subject, it's great to choose somebody real, because then you have some kind of context and a structure for their lives. But somebody we hardly know anything about, because then you can make all sorts of things up, and you can put them in different situations where you want them to be, meet different people, and you won't be in fear of those letters from readers saying, no, that didn't really happen. No, she wasn't really there, because nobody knows. But we know that my heroine, the marvellously named Frances Gorges, there is a name I couldn't have made up unless I'd been Charles Dickens, I think. We know the bare bones of her life. We know that she was the daughter of one of Elizabeth I's favourite ladies in waiting. We know that she married a prominent courtier of James I, and we know hardly anything else. But that was enough for me. I needed her to have known both the Tudors and the Stuarts for my plot to work.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely brilliant, and it's so, everything about it's so rich with detail. I loved it. You really felt immersed in it. All the details just were so vivid. That, like, the food, the costume, the architecture, the smells. It was really immersive. It was fantastic.
Brilliant.
I guess your research for the book, you obviously had a really thorough background before, but did it take you to some quite eye-opening different sources, or to visit some great places?
It really did, and I'm so pleased you found that, because I felt immersed in all of those details, particularly as my heroine is a healer, so I had to get very well conversed in the art of kind of herbal remedies and all these weird and wonderful things. Yeah, the research was very different to my non-fiction, which is much more about sort of politics and events and state papers and that kind of thing. This was much more social history, and even just writing a sentence such as Frances reached for her glass of wine. Well, would she have drunk wine? Would she have been drinking from a glass? Would it, all of that, all of those details, it was almost impossible to write anything without doing some social history research first. And so I did delve into the archives. I have to say I found the palaces enormously helpful. Just being in the spaces, being able to just sit and, from my desk at Hampton Court, kind of imagine a scene with Frances. That was really, really helpful. And also going to places like Cork Abbey in Derbyshire. They've recreated a Tudor herb garden, for example. So I went to places as much as possible. And I think the biggest challenge for me was actually getting inside Frances's childhood home, which is Longford Castle in Wiltshire, because it's privately owned. They don't really like letting people in. And it was only thanks to knowing someone who knows someone whose next door neighbour wants, this whole trail went on, that I managed to get in and had a tour with Lord Rutland himself and Lord Radnor, and it was wonderful. And there's no substitute for that, for actually going to the places that you're writing about. So I did an awful lot of that.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing that the spaces that you're talking about, a lot of them are still there. So, for example, when you're describing parts of the Tower of London or Hampton Court, you can really visualize that. And some of the the routes that the characters walk, you can walk that route today in the Tower, and it gave me goosebumps.
Oh, good, because obviously you'll appreciate that as well. I was kind of just, some scenes were easier to imagine than others, because, if we work for the palaces, then we know those routes really, really well. But that it was really important to me to keep it authentic and to actually describe places as they were. Now, the bigger challenge were when the places don't exist anymore, such as Whitehall Palace, where an awful lot of the action takes place. And of course, we have the banqueting house now, and some of the kind of original Tudor cellars, but not much else. And so that was much more down to looking at contemporary paintings of the palace, reading descriptions in letters and papers and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting, that period of history, because I guess because Palace of Whitehall isn't there anymore, a lot of people might not even be aware that there was a palace there. You know, it's kind of forgotten. So it's really interesting that a lot of the action, as it were, takes place in that palace.
Exactly, and it was huge. It was one of the biggest palaces in the kind of English monarchy's collection, really. So, yeah, it's hard to imagine when you look at the footprint of modern day Whitehall. And I mean, at Historical Palaces, we did that wonderful project, the Lost Palace, where we kind of created a trail for people to follow and actually get a sense of the whole footprint of the original palace. But hopefully, you know, reading the book will inspire people to go and walk those paths, even though it looks completely different nowadays.
Yeah, it certainly prompted me to think it's one of the places that I'd like to find out a bit more about. The other thing it really made me want to read more about was gunpowder, treason and plot.
Oh, yes.
It was just really fascinating. It just gave me a real insight, because I guess a lot of people know about the gunpowder plot, and I'm not giving anything away by mentioning it. But I guess to find out about the characters, as well as Francis, you know, you're dealing with real historical characters there. Could you tell us a little bit more about, you know, who is really interesting to get the dirty on?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or the clean, maybe.
Or the clean. I have to say, Alice, and this is a terrible confession, but because I got so into it and I really started to sympathise with the gunpowder plotters, because without giving too much away, you know, they're more on the side of good in my novel, evil. And I found myself, the more I found out about James I, the more I really wished they'd succeeded and that Guy Fawkes hadn't been found in the nick of time. You know, it's quite extraordinary. But I think the character I got most interested in was Thomas Wintour, or Winter, it's often spelt, who was a cousin of the ringleader, Robert Catesby. So people tend to think Guy Fawkes is the leader. He was just the kind of the fall guy, really. He was there with the gunpowder. It was Robert Catesby who was the very charismatic character. I think we know most about the plot because of him, because he left behind this very long, detailed signed confession, and it gave a lot more detail than any others. One would say a suspicious amount of detail, as if the authorities had actually put words in his mouth, but that is open to conjecture. But he became the hero quite soon for me. I researched each of the plotters, and without giving too much away, I needed to find one that wasn't married. And so Thomas Wintour, that's what really put him ahead of the rest, but also just this amazing testimony that he left behind. It really made me just want to find out more about him. But as with so much of that story, there are so many gaps, and that's when really it inspired me to just go off on all sorts of different plot lines and what ifs. Above all, who was really behind it? Because the thing that not everybody realizes is that every single one of the gunpowder plotters who was captured spoke of some great patron who'd sort of put them up to it. And it's just intriguing to think who that may have been. The number one contender is often Lord Cecil, who was actually the king's chief minister. But the idea is this is some great Catholic conspiracy. Cecil wanted to get rid of Catholics, so he made sure this plot would come to light and be discovered just in time, and everybody would think, what a terrible plot, let's get rid of Catholics. So that's the theory, but I came up with a different one, which I'm definitely not going to give away.
No, it was it was really exciting, and as you say, that going a bit further into the characters and the reasons behind the plot, because you know everyone knows that Guy Fawkes tried to blow up Parliament, but I guess I hadn't really thought about the social context and a lot about the persecution and the background, and I didn't really know that much, I'm ashamed to say, about James I and VI. So I find it really, really interesting, really engaging. And I guess even though at the back of my mind, part of me knew the outcome for the plotters, it was still really exciting. You didn't know what was going to happen. It was really enjoyed it.
Oh, that's really what I wanted, because that's the danger of writing it quite a well-known event in history. People know what's going to happen. So
but there were still surprises, and I didn't know just the kind of the background between what they were behind what they were planning, and how they were going to put something else in place. It was absolutely loved it. This is my well-thumbed version here. Really enjoyed it. So I'm about to start on The Devil's Slave, which is the next one in the trilogy.
I can now wave that. Look, there we go.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, and the beautiful covers as well. I've been enjoying this.
Oh good. I'm pleased you like them.
I love this historical illustration of Westminster and in the Lost Palace as well. It's great.
Oh, good.
And so I'm looking forward to reading that. And even though you very kindly arranged an advance copy of The Fallen Angel, I feel like I can't start that until I've read The Devil's Slave, because I don't want to give anything away.
Yeah.
How long are we going to have to wait for The Fallen Angel?
So The Fallen Angel was due out this month in June, but obviously events overtook us. But very appropriately, it's now going to be launched on Bonfire Night, the 5th of November.
Maybe there's witchcraft behind it.
I kind of think there's got to be something behind that. I don't think the publishers genuinely realise the significance, and then it's like, oh yeah, actually that's a really good date to launch it. So I'm quite pleased. It's turned out well.
Brilliant. No, it's worked really well, and certainly I've been really enjoying it. I hadn't read a historical novel for a while, but I got really into it. My husband has had quite a lack of conversation from me like this.
Yeah, don't talk to me.
Exactly. Well, maybe he's enjoyed peace and quiet. So I know we were talking about challenges of the difference between having that fictional approach, and it's quite different. Have you got plans to write any more novels?
I hope so. I would really love to. And having covered the first part of the Stuart period, I would like to go back to my bread and butter and do something Tudor. Now, I did consciously avoid the Tudors actually for my first novel, because I thought it's quite a well-trodden ground for historical fiction as for non-fiction. But I have a few ideas that are bubbling away. But first comes the non-fiction. I've got 2 non-fiction books to finish, so it won't be for a little while, but I'm cooking some ideas in the meantime, which is what lockdown is great for. I think that people keep quoting all these great books that were written during lockdown, so I'm kind of inspired by that. What am I going to produce during lockdown?
Brilliant. So I guess your most recent non-fiction, this was Henry VIII and the Men Who Made Him.
Here's one I made earlier. Yes,
that's very handy.
They're very handy, out now in paperback. So there we go. Yes.
Excellent. So I guess Henry VIII, as you say, Tudors are a relatively well-trodden path, and I guess we mostly know Henry for his wives, but the title of this is The Men Who Made Him. So why did you choose this subject?
Well, I've wanted to tackle Henry for a number of years, but he is quite an intimidating subject, both because of his character, but also because lots of very distinguished historians have written about him before. So I wanted to be reassured rather, that I had something genuinely different to say about him. And the more I read about him, the more it was just all about the 6 wives. And of course, it's fascinating. You couldn't make it up when it comes to his love life and his marital history. But it made me think, well, what about the other side to the story? What about the men who surrounded him? Now, we know more about some than others. Thomas Cromwell, I'm guilty of being a bit obsessed with him and have written about him. Thomas Wolsey, Thomas More, the big hitters, we sort of know about them, but nobody had ever tackled a sort of composite biography of Henry and all of the key male influences. So that was my inspiration. And I didn't know if there would be enough to say, if there would be enough to kind of shape a narrative around this. And I very soon realized there was enough for about 10 books. And I really had to be quite brutal in cutting out some very, very interesting, significant figures in the interest of keeping vaguely to my word counts. So this is really a cradle to grave biography of Henry, but it's through the eyes just of the men. And so from his father, Henry VII, who was my own personal favourite, through to his courtiers, his rivals, his friends, his son Edward, of course. So all the way up to his later years and the men who served him and interacted with him then. Fascinating for me because I thought I knew Henry. Having studied the Tudors for quite a number of years, it felt like meeting him for the first time by the time I'd finished my research.
Well, that's really interesting because I guess in a way to a lot of people he might seem like quite a two-dimensional character, you know, this kind of slightly obnoxious, larger than life, had lots of wives, you know, told people what to do all the time. But, you know, obviously there's a lot more to him than that. So I guess even though it was probably a bit daunting to write about somebody that a lot is known about, you must have found some new and quite surprising things about him.
Absolutely. And I thought that was so interesting because I started off with the same kind of perception of him really as this kind of monster, almost a caricature really, you know, chopping off wives' heads and the old chicken bones over their shoulders, or, you know, that kind of thing. But in fact, what surprised me in particular about Henry was just how timid he was, quite fearful as a person. I think his childhood had shaped him in that respect. He was very, very painfully aware of the early death of his elder brother Arthur, who should have been king when he was just 15. And then Henry himself, as the only male heir of Henry VII, was wrapped in cotton wool. There was a lot of anxiety surrounding him so that he would absolutely survive to be king. And that really impacted on Henry. He became something of a hypochondriac, really, when he reached adulthood. Always a bit fearful, quite insecure. And I think that surprised me as well, because you tend to think of Henry, you know, he's larger than life, he's stridently self-confident, but that was all just image. At heart, I think he was absolutely aware of the frankly rather dodgy claim to the throne that the Tudors had. They were descended from an illegitimate line ultimately. And Henry was only the second Tudor monarch. We look back now at this great all-powerful dynasty. Nobody thought they would survive. There were other claimants to the throne with a better, stronger bloodline than Henry. So you see that sort of vulnerability. But I think the thing that most surprised me was how gullible Henry was. He was really easy to manipulate. And you see the men around him doing that increasingly skillfully. Men such as Thomas More, who kind of compared treating Henry to being like a lion tamer, you know, don't let the beast know his own strength, or words to that effect. And they did just constantly pull the wool over Henry's eyes. He would believe the last person in the room. And he just, that really struck me, because I always thought it was Henry kind of pulling all the strings, wielding all the power. But actually, when you look at what was going on behind the scenes, he was really a puppet, actually, for much of his reign.
Yeah, I guess as you say, he's really dependent on a lot of the other people around him to support him and inform him, because he can't really go out and do it for himself necessarily.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you can draw modern day parallels with all sorts of political figures and leaders about, you know, those around them, how they are kind of manipulating them and putting words in their mouth and all the rest of it. And you particularly see that with Henry when it comes to the Reformation, where he's in theory embracing all of these new reformed ideas, but then in the next breath he's kind of going back to a more traditional Catholic version of events, and you just think, what did he actually think? And that was the real challenge, getting to the real Henry, not the words that were put into his mouth by the men around him.
Yeah, no, it sounds really interesting to get that kind of insight into, to reach out more into these other like lesser known characters as well. Were there any particular favourite characters that you came across?
Yeah, there were, and it's actually the lesser known ones who really appealed to me most, because much as I love Thomas Cromwell, and I won't hear a bad word said against him, it was the sort of the ones who've lived in the shadows more, who I found most intriguing. So, for example, his favourite physician, who was called Dr. William Butts. Now, he served Henry and his family for 20 years, and he served his queens as well as Henry himself. Now, in theory, he was just a physician, a very skillful physician, actually. He had a good track record at healing people, which isn't often said about physicians in the Tudor period. But as well as that, he was something of a radical in religious matters. And you can see how he influenced Henry, because to influence the king, you just have to spend time with him. And so you don't just need to look at his counselors, his advisors. It's the people who are serving him in private. In a way, they have just as much influence because they're spending a lot of time with Henry. And that was definitely the case with William Butts. And what I like about him is he wasn't afraid of Henry. He told him how it was. He told him off when he was when his diet had got bad and he was putting on weight. And he told him off when he was veering from the true path of religion. And you can imagine Henry sort of meekly cowering before this kind of rather fearsome doctor figure who would visit him on a regular basis. I really did warm to William Butts. I think anyone who was brave enough to tell Henry the truth deserves some credit. So he was a good example. And also the likes of Will Summer, who was Henry's favourite jester. And just looking at his character, possibly his disabilities, because actually Tudor fools were what was known as sort of natural fools, more than just jesters who were kind of comedians. They probably had some kind of learning difficulties, and they weren't laughed at, they were revered. They were absolutely revered by the Tudors because they were believed to just say words that came straight from God, because they didn't have the same kind of political guile as the rest of the people at court. They just said whatever came into their head. And therefore, you could be guaranteed the truth from a fool, as they were called. And Will Summer became a really treasured member of Henry's household, and he spent probably more time alone with him than any of his other men. So I found all of that really fascinating.
That's really interesting, and I can really see, especially after reading The King's Witch, how somebody that just speaks the truth would be quite valued, because there's so much backstabbing and intrigue,
Yes.
and lying and maneuvering. You know, it's fascinating, but you just think, well, somebody tell the truth.
Yes, just do it. Say what's actually going on, not thinking about feathering your own nest or manipulating the king or whatever it may be. And yeah, so it's often the lesser known characters who do that. And I think that's why they held real appeal to Henry, and indeed to me when I was researching the book.
Oh, it sounds brilliant. So what you mentioned, you were working on a couple of other non-fiction things
Yes.
at the moment. Are you able to say anything about?
Yes, I am. Well, certainly about the most imminent one. Now, this has relevance to our work at the palaces and nationwide, really, because my next non-fiction book is my biggest ever in every sense. It's a history of the monarchy. So from 1066 to the present day. So huge span of history, dazzling cast of characters. Can you imagine what I felt like on day one of starting that book? It's like I came up with all sorts of diversionary tactics to avoid writing that first sentence in a 1,000-year history of the monarchy. My paper clips have never been so well organised as they were that day. But it is an absolute joy and such a journey of discovery for me, because as I said, I'm first and foremost a Tudor historian. I've since kind of strayed into the Stuarts. I've also written on the Georgians, but that broad sweep of history is something that I've never explored in detail. And I have become completely fascinated by a whole range of monarchs who, for me, had really just been footnotes until now. But it's been really, really lovely to get a much broader idea of our monarchy, and also just to see how often the palaces feature, and the Tower of London in particular. Really, it's just there. It's there, particularly in the early part of the book. Obviously, it was built by William the Conqueror, and then used heavily by all the medieval monarchs. So it's nice to see. It feels like I'm kind of there, even though we're not able to visit at the moment. So that is a big challenge of a book. And I have to say that if it hadn't been for lockdown, I don't know how I'd have got it written, but it is steaming ahead.
Brilliant. Well, I can't wait. It's going to be, yeah, really, really interesting.
Thank you.
Look forward to that. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. It's been really lovely to talk to you. Lovely to see you, because obviously we haven't seen any historic royal palaces, faces, or sites for for quite a few months now. So
you know, Alice, it gave me an excuse to wash my hair, which is something that doesn't happen every day, I have to admit. But
likewise. So yeah, thank you so much, and absolutely love this, and can't wait to read The Devil's Slave. And I'm almost torn now. Do I start it now? Because then when I finish it, I'm going to have to wait till November for The Fallen Angel. But maybe I read Henry in the meantime.
Read Henry. If you're a fast reader, I think you need to do that. Otherwise, you know, just slowly, maybe do a chapter a week of The Devil's Slave. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll eke it out. I don't think I can though, because literally I was like getting up first thing in the morning and coming downstairs before Mark was even awake and reading it.
That's lovely to hear. Wow.
I really enjoyed it. And again, if it wasn't for lockdown, I'm not sure that I would have been able to spend that time.
I know. I think that's a real joy for many people, I've heard, is that just the number of books that people are able to read. Finally, books they've been meaning to read for ages. And I can relate to that too. My pile of to read books is rapidly diminishing, which is wonderful.
Yeah, it's nice to get through them, but then I keep adding them as fast as I get through them.
Wow.
Anyway, I'll leave you in peace to have a free afternoon. But thank you so much again for your time, and hopefully we can catch up again in person at Hampton Court sometime.
I hope so. It's been lovely to talk to you though. Thank you.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Massive thanks to Tracy and to Alice for that wonderful conversation. So King's Witch and various other books by Tracy are all available in our bookshop. Give us a call on 01442 827 653. All the other purchase blurb is available in the text below. We've got loads more interviews to come, so do subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll see you for the next one.